In the spring of 1927, one of America's most powerful rivers suddenly broke beyond its limits. Within days, entire towns were underwater. Thousands of homes were destroyed. Millions of acres of farmland disappeared beneath the flood. And nearly 700,000 people were forced from their homes. But the terrifying part was, people knew the danger was coming. They watched the river rise. They watched the levees weaken. But they had no idea which levee would break first. Then, one day, one of them finally collapsed. And from that moment on, the Mississippi River was no longer just a river. It had become a force powerful enough to transform an entire region of America. But the most frightening chapter of this disaster was not simply the towns disappearing beneath the water. Because even after the water was gone, the consequences of the flood would remain in American politics and society for years. This was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. And this is the story of that devastating disaster. Before 1927, the Mississippi River was a vital part of American life. Farmers depended on the rich soil surrounding the river to grow cotton, rice, and other crops. Trade moved along the river, and entire communities had grown around its banks. But the same river that provided life could also become deadly. Beginning in 1926, unusually heavy rainfall began across large parts of the Mississippi River basin. This was not just one storm. Rain kept coming. The ground slowly became saturated. Rivers and smaller waterways began filling with water. Then came the spring of 1927, and the situation became even worse. The rain seemed endless. Day after day, week after week, the water kept rising. People looked toward the river and realized something terrible was coming. But they still had one thing they believed could protect them: levees. Massive earthen walls built along the river. These levees were supposed to keep the Mississippi River inside its channel. People believed that no matter how high the water rose, the levees would hold. But as the pressure increased, the levees began to weaken. Cracks appeared. The river pushed harder. And eventually, the moment everyone feared arrived. April 16th, 1927. Near Mound's Landing in the Mississippi Delta, a levee failed. Then everything changed. A massive wall of water rushed through the opening. Fields disappeared within hours. Roads vanished. Homes were surrounded by water. And crops that farmers had spent months growing were destroyed almost instantly. People began running for higher ground. Some climbed into boats. Others climbed onto rooftops. Some searched desperately for anywhere that was above the rising water. But the most terrifying part was, this was only the beginning. The water did not stop. The enormous Mississippi River continued moving south. One community after another was overwhelmed. And ahead of the flood was a vast region where millions of people depended on the river for their lives. But now, the river itself had become their greatest enemy. And the next chapter of the disaster would be even more devastating. Because the question was no longer simply, who could save their home? The question was, who would survive?
As floodwater spread across the Mississippi Delta, thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes. But not everyone had a way to escape. Poor farmers and sharecropper families were especially vulnerable. Many did not own the land they worked. Many had very little money, and they had nowhere to go. Thousands of people were eventually forced into temporary camps. Food was limited. Clean water was difficult to find. Medical care was inadequate. And everywhere they looked, there was water. The American Red Cross launched a massive relief operation. Boats carried food and supplies into flooded areas. Volunteers rescued people trapped by the rising water. Doctors and nurses treated the sick and injured. But life inside the relief camps was not always safe or fair. African American flood victims, in particular, faced discrimination and harsh conditions. Some were forced into difficult labor in exchange for relief. As a result, the flood became more than a natural disaster. It became a social and political crisis. Meanwhile, the Mississippi River continued moving south. Floodwaters spread across Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Missouri, and several other states. Around 27,000 square miles of land were submerged. Nearly 700,000 people were directly displaced or affected. Millions of acres of farmland were destroyed. Homes, roads, railways, and businesses suffered enormous damage. But the river still had not finished. As the flood moved towards Louisiana, another major city came into danger: New Orleans. The city was one of the most important economic centers in the region. If the Mississippi River overwhelmed New Orleans, the consequences could have been cataclysmic. So officials made an extremely controversial decision. They planned to divert the floodwater away from New Orleans. Near Carnarvon, Louisiana, a levee was deliberately destroyed. Explosives were used to break through part of the levee. The water was redirected. New Orleans was protected from the worst of the flooding. But someone else had to pay the price. Thousands of people living in the surrounding areas lost their homes and farmland. Even decades later, the decision remained one of the most controversial moments of the disaster. Eventually, after months of flooding, the Mississippi River began to fall. But when the water finally receded, the damage left behind was devastating. Homes had been destroyed, farmland was ruined, roads were covered in mud, and countless families had to rebuild their lives from almost nothing. But the flood had done more than destroyed property. It had changed America. One of the most important figures in the relief effort was Herbert Hoover. His leadership during the disaster brought him national attention. And only 2 years later, in 1929, Hoover became President of the United States. The flood also had a lasting political impact. The treatment of African American victims during the disaster contributed to growing political dissatisfaction. In the years that followed, African American political loyalties began to shift significantly. So the flood did not simply reshape the land, it also helped reshape American politics. Today, nearly a century later, the Mississippi River remains one of the most important rivers in America. Millions of people still live and work near its banks. But the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 left behind a powerful lesson. People can build massive levees, they can try to control rivers, they can fight against nature, but they can never completely control it. Because in 1927, there was no war, no invading army, no battlefield, just rain and a rising river, and that was enough to devastate an enormous part of America. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 was more than a story about water. It was a story of survival, a story of helplessness, a story of inequality, a story of political change, and a story of the terrifying moment when a river crossed its limits and reminded an entire nation that no matter how powerful humanity becomes, sometimes all it takes is a river.